Tonight, we're covering the life and legacy of the legendary American President Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln was a wise, resilient, and groundbreaking leader who skillfully guided the nation through its greatest crisis, preserved the Union, and redefined freedom for generations to come. His leadership during the Civil War and his fight to end slavery continue to inspire people around the world today. So, before we all get nice and comfortable, take a moment, if you haven't already, to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, let us know the time and location from which you are watching. Now, let's get right into our fascinating story, and we hope it helps you learn while you sleep. In the stillness of a winter morning on February 12, 1809, in a small one-room log cabin in Hardin County, Kentucky, a boy named Abraham Lincoln was born. His arrival was unceremonious, like many on the American frontier, but this child would one day grow to become one of the most consequential figures in American history, a president, emancipator, and unifier in the nation's darkest hour. Abraham was born to Thomas and Nancy Hanks Lincoln, simple pioneers with little wealth and even less education. The Lincolns lived on the edge of the American frontier, where life was rough, uncertain, and filled with backbreaking labor. Thomas was a carpenter and farmer, a hardworking man who struggled to maintain stability for his family. Nancy, quiet and nurturing, shaped Abraham's early sense of right and wrong through stories from the Bible and frontier values of honesty, compassion, and perseverance. From a young age, Abraham displayed a natural curiosity and a deep hunger for learning. But on the frontier, education was scarce. Schools were one-room structures, and teachers often barely more educated than the students. Over the course of his entire childhood, Lincoln received less than a year of formal schooling. Yet that didn't stop him. He read voraciously, borrowing books from neighbors whenever he could find them. He taught himself through anything he could get his hands on: Aesop's fables, Robinson Crusoe, the Bible, and later Shakespeare. When Abraham was just 9 years old, tragedy struck. His mother, Nancy, died of milk sickness, a common but deadly illness on the frontier caused by drinking the milk of cows that had eaten a poisonous plant. Her death shook young Abraham to his core. He later said that everything he was or hoped to be, he owed to his mother. Her loss left a void that would echo through his life. His father, Thomas, remarried the following year. His new wife, Sarah Bush Johnston Lincoln, was a widow from Kentucky with 3 children of her own. Sarah brought warmth and stability to the Lincoln home. She recognized Abraham's intellect and thirst for knowledge, encouraging his reading and studies. She treated him as her own son, and in return, Abraham grew to love her dearly. In Sarah, he found a lifelong supporter, one who nurtured his dreams and helped shape the thoughtful man he would become. As Abraham grew, so did his reputation for honesty and physical strength. Tall and lean, he worked hard on the farm, splitting rails, hauling wood, and helping his father clear land. He was known for his integrity, often traveling miles to return a few cents he had overcharged or a borrowed book. Neighbors began calling him Honest Abe, a name that would follow him for the rest of his life. In 1816, the Lincolns moved to Indiana, seeking more stable land and better prospects. The move marked a new chapter in Abraham's life, one filled with more challenges but also new opportunities. It was in Indiana that Abraham began to discover not just who he was, but who he might become. As he matured into a young man, Abraham Lincoln's mind stretched beyond the boundaries of his log cabin and fields. He started thinking about the world outside, about ideas, justice, law, and fairness. He would later say, "The things I want to know are in books. My best friend is the man who'll get me a book I ain't read." Little did the world know that this tall, thoughtful boy with a worn Bible in one hand and an axe in the other would one day hold the highest office in the land, and steer a divided nation through its greatest trial. By the time Abraham Lincoln reached his early 20s, he had already lived through hardship, loss, and long days of labor under the hot sun and bitter cold. Yet something inside him was restless. He had grown tall, towering over most men at 6'4", and his mind was even more expansive. Books, ideas, and the world beyond the frontier tugged at him. He was no longer content with just swinging an axe or tilling soil. In 1830, the Lincoln family moved again, this time to Illinois. Abraham helped build the new homestead near Decatur, but he was growing less interested in farming. He wanted something more, something beyond clearing land and survival. At 22, he left home for good, ready to forge his own path. His first stop was the small village of New Salem, Illinois. The town was little more than a collection of cabins, but it became the setting for Lincoln's early transformation. He worked odd jobs, splitting rails, managing a general store, and eventually becoming the postmaster. Though he had little formal education, Abraham's reputation for honesty, hard work, and fairness quickly spread through the town. He listened more than he spoke, but when he did speak, people listened. He had a natural gift for storytelling, and his sharp sense of humor and empathy made him both respected and well-liked. During this time, he began reading law books borrowed from a local attorney. By candlelight, after long days of work, Lincoln pored over Blackstone's commentaries and other legal texts, teaching himself law the same way he had taught himself nearly everything else. It was in New Salem that Lincoln first discovered the idea that would define his life, that the law could be a tool for justice and fairness. But Lincoln's journey into public life didn't begin in a courtroom, it began on the battlefield. In 1832, the Black Hawk War broke out between the United States and Native American tribes. Lincoln volunteered to serve in the Illinois militia. He was elected captain of his company, a position that filled him with pride, though he saw no combat. Years later, he would joke that he had seen plenty of bloodshed from mosquitoes. After the war, Lincoln returned to New Salem and ran for the Illinois state legislature. He lost his first election, but he didn't give up. He tried again in 1834, and this time, he won. At just 25 years old, he entered the world of politics. He didn't yet have a formal legal education, but his intelligence, humility, and belief in fairness quickly earned him respect. He joined the Whig Party, which supported infrastructure, education, and economic development. These ideas appealed to Lincoln, who believed deeply in opportunity and progress. That same year, he officially began studying law in earnest. He moved to Springfield, the state capital, and in 1836, he passed the bar exam. He became a practicing attorney, soon building a reputation as a brilliant and ethical lawyer. He traveled from town to town as a circuit lawyer, often riding alone on horseback for miles through the countryside. In courtrooms across Illinois, he impressed juries and judges with his clarity, wit, and deep sense of justice. During these years, Lincoln's political philosophy took shape. He believed that hard work, honesty, and education should be the foundation of a good society. He hated slavery, though he didn't yet call for its immediate end. Still, he believed it was morally wrong, and that its expansion should be stopped. Abraham Lincoln had left the log cabin behind, but not the values it had instilled in him. He had found a place in the world, as a lawyer, a legislator, and a voice for common people. And though he could not yet know it, his greatest challenges, and his most enduring contributions, still lay ahead. By the late 1830s, Abraham Lincoln had made a name for himself in Springfield, Illinois. As a young lawyer, he was respected for his honesty, logic, and ability to connect with juries. He wasn't flashy, his clothes were plain, his posture awkward, but when he spoke, people paid attention. His words were thoughtful, carefully chosen, and often deeply moving. Lincoln shared a law office with his friend William Herndon. Together, they represented farmers, merchants, widows, and townspeople across central Illinois. Lincoln's approach to law was practical and principled. He disliked taking cases that relied on trickery or technicalities. Instead, he relied on truth and reason, often turning complex legal arguments into simple, powerful stories. His sense of fairness was his compass, and his clients loved him for it. While Lincoln was finding his place professionally, he also sought stability in his personal life. He had experienced heartbreak before, in particular, the tragic death of Anne Rutledge, a young woman he had deeply cared for in New Salem. Her passing had cast a long shadow over his emotional world. But in Springfield, he met Mary Todd, a bright, ambitious woman from a prominent Kentucky family. Mary was educated, politically aware, and attracted to Lincoln's intelligence and depth. Though their courtship was rocky, and at one point called off, they eventually reconciled and married on November 4, 1842. The Lincolns were, in many ways, opposites. Mary was refined and came from wealth. Abraham was awkward, poor, and self-taught. But they shared a sharp intellect and a deep interest in politics. Over time, they built a home filled with love, hardship, and 4 sons: Robert, Edward, William, Willie, and Thomas Tad. Only Robert would live to adulthood. The early loss of Edward, and later of Willie, would profoundly affect both parents and deepen Lincoln's already solemn temperament. Lincoln's political career continued to grow alongside his legal one. He served 4 terms in the Illinois state legislature, earning a reputation for careful thinking and principled votes. He opposed the spread of slavery but did so cautiously, understanding how deeply the issue divided the country. In 1846, he was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives, a major step forward. As a congressman, he opposed the Mexican-American War, criticizing it as an unjust conflict started under false pretenses. This stance was unpopular, especially in the patriotic fervor of the time, and Lincoln's term in Congress was his only one. He did not seek re-election. After his term ended in 1849, Lincoln returned to Springfield, stepping away from national politics for a time. He focused on his law practice and raising his children. Yet the national debate over slavery was intensifying, and Lincoln watched it closely. The Missouri Compromise, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and violent clashes like Bleeding Kansas revealed the deepening crisis. The idea that slavery might expand into new Western territories alarmed Lincoln. He believed that if slavery spread, the very ideals of the Republic, liberty, equality, and justice, would be undermined. It was the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, which allowed new territories to decide for themselves whether to permit slavery, that reignited Lincoln's political fire. He saw it not as a compromise, but as a betrayal of the nation's founding principles. He began speaking publicly again, sharpening his arguments, and warning of slavery's corrosive effect on democracy. His speeches were precise, moral, and powerful. People listened. Though he had once stepped away from public life, Abraham Lincoln was now being drawn back in by forces larger than himself. The nation was changing, fracturing, and he knew he had a role to play. He had found his voice not just as a lawyer or a legislator, but as a moral leader. The road ahead would be long and filled with conflict. But Lincoln was no longer just a frontier lawyer. He was becoming something more, a statesman ready to rise when his country needed him most. By the mid-1850s, America was being pulled apart. The issue of slavery, its morality, its legality, and its expansion into new territories, dominated every political conversation. Abraham Lincoln, though not yet a national figure, was rapidly becoming one of the most compelling voices against its spread. He believed slavery was incompatible with the founding principles of the nation, and he was determined to challenge its growing influence. In 1854, the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act had opened new territories to the possibility of slavery, effectively nullifying the Missouri Compromise. This law, championed by Illinois Senator Stephen A. Douglas, outraged Lincoln. He saw it as a dangerous concession to slaveholding interests and a threat to the very soul of the Union. Lincoln returned to politics with renewed passion. In 1858, he ran for the U.S. Senate against none other than Douglas himself. It was during this campaign that Lincoln delivered one of his most famous and controversial speeches, the House Divided address. Standing before a crowd in Springfield, he declared, "A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure, permanently half slave and half free." The words sent shockwaves through the political establishment. Some called them radical, others called them prophetic. Lincoln wasn't calling for war, he was calling for clarity. He believed the country would eventually have to choose. It would either become all slave or all free. There could be no lasting compromise. The campaign led to a series of public debates between Lincoln and Douglas, 7 in total, held across Illinois. Thousands gathered to hear them speak, and newspapers around the country reported their words in full. These weren't just political sparring matches, they were deep, philosophical battles over the future of the nation. Douglas argued for popular sovereignty, the idea that each territory should decide for itself whether to allow slavery. He tried to paint Lincoln as an abolitionist who would destroy the Union. Lincoln, for his part, insisted he had no intention to abolish slavery where it already existed, but he firmly opposed its expansion. He believed the Founding Fathers had intended slavery to eventually die out, and he saw its spread as a betrayal of that vision. Lincoln's performance during the debates was powerful. Though he lost the Senate race, the debates elevated him to national prominence. He had challenged one of the most prominent politicians in the country, and held his own with intellect, clarity, and moral conviction. More importantly, the debates revealed something deeper: Lincoln's ability to articulate the conflict tearing the country apart, not with rage, but with reason. He didn't preach hatred. He appealed to the better angels of the American character, invoking the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and the shared ideals of liberty and equality. As tensions continued to rise, the political landscape began to shift. The Whig Party collapsed, and the Republican Party emerged as a new force, built largely on opposition to the expansion of slavery. Lincoln, with his growing national reputation, became one of the party's rising stars. By 1860, Lincoln's name was being mentioned as a possible presidential candidate. Many dismissed the idea at first. He was still, in many minds, just a backwoods lawyer from Illinois. But others saw what was happening. In a time of crisis, the country didn't need a politician with polish. It needed a leader with principle. Lincoln's time was coming. The debates with Douglas had made that clear. He was no longer a man only of Illinois. He was becoming a man for the entire nation. By the end of the 1850s, Abraham Lincoln had emerged as one of the most compelling voices in American politics. Though he had lost the 1858 Senate race to Stephen Douglas, the nationally covered debates had turned Lincoln into a household name. He was admired for his moral clarity, eloquence, and steady leadership in the face of a deepening national crisis. The country was teetering on the edge. Slavery had become more than a political issue. It was a moral fault line, splitting the nation in two. The violence in Bleeding Kansas, the Supreme Court's infamous Dred Scott decision, and John Brown's raid at Harper's Ferry had all intensified the tension. In this atmosphere, Americans began to look for someone who could steady the ship. For many, that person was Abraham Lincoln. In 1860, at the Republican National Convention in Chicago, Lincoln's name was entered into nomination for president. He wasn't the favorite. New York Senator William Seward was the presumed frontrunner. But Lincoln had advantages. He was from a crucial swing state, he was seen as a unifier, and he had no enemies within the party. Most importantly, his message, firm opposition to the expansion of slavery, but without calls for immediate abolition, appealed to both moderates and moralists. Lincoln's team worked the convention masterfully. On the third ballot, he secured the nomination. The news swept across the country. The tall, self-taught lawyer from Illinois, the rail splitter, as he was affectionately known, would be the Republican Party's first successful presidential candidate. The general election was one of the most divisive in American history. Lincoln ran against three other candidates: Stephen Douglas, Northern Democrat; John C. Breckinridge, Southern Democrat; and John Bell, Constitutional Union Party. The country was so fractured that Lincoln won the presidency with less than 40% of the popular vote, but a clear majority in the Electoral College. To many in the South, Lincoln's election was unacceptable. Though he had repeatedly said he had no intention of abolishing slavery where it already existed, Southern leaders believed his presidency threatened their way of life. Before Lincoln could even take office, Southern states began to secede from the Union. South Carolina was first, followed quickly by Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. In February 1861, these states formed the Confederate States of America. As Lincoln prepared to assume the presidency, he understood the gravity of the moment. He had won the nation's highest office, but inherited a fractured country. There were whispers of assassination, plots to derail his inauguration, and fears that civil war was inevitable. On March 4, 1861, Lincoln delivered his first inaugural address from the steps of the U.S. Capitol. It was a plea for unity. In it, he said, "We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection." But even as he spoke those words, war clouds gathered. The Confederacy had seized federal forts and armories in the South, and Lincoln faced a choice: allow the Union to dissolve, or fight to preserve it. The man who had once studied law by candlelight in a frontier cabin was now the President of the United States. A nation looked to him, not just for policy, but for hope. The Union was crumbling. And Abraham Lincoln, with his humble beginnings, deep convictions, and quiet strength, would be called to hold it together. When Abraham Lincoln took the oath of office in March 1861, he inherited not just a divided nation, but a disintegrating one. 7 southern states had already seceded, forming the Confederate States of America. They had written their own constitution, elected Jefferson Davis as president, and seized federal property throughout the South. Tensions were no longer political, they were military. The question was not if war would come, but when. The flashpoint arrived in April, just weeks after Lincoln's inauguration. In Charleston Harbor, South Carolina, a Union garrison remained stationed at Fort Sumter, refusing to surrender to Confederate forces. Lincoln faced a critical decision. If he ordered the fort evacuated, he would appear weak and legitimize secession. If he sent reinforcements, he risked provoking open war. Lincoln made a careful choice. He would send food, not weapons, to the starving soldiers at Fort Sumter. The message was clear: the North would not fire first, but it would not abandon its position. The Confederacy responded with cannon fire. On April 12, 1861, Confederate forces opened bombardment on Fort Sumter. The Civil War had begun. The fall of Fort Sumter electrified the nation. Lincoln responded swiftly, calling for 75,000 volunteers to put down the rebellion. The response in the North was immediate and overwhelming. Men flooded recruitment offices. Flags flew. Patriotic songs rang out. But the South was equally galvanized. 4 more states, Virginia, Arkansas, North Carolina, and Tennessee, seceded, joining the Confederacy. The war was now full-scale. Lincoln moved quickly to prepare the Union for war. He expanded the Army and Navy, suspended habeas corpus in some areas to maintain order, and authorized the use of federal funds without congressional approval. Critics accused him of overreach, but Lincoln saw the Union's survival as a moral imperative. The Constitution, he believed, was designed to preserve liberty, but it could not do so if the nation itself ceased to exist. Early in the war, the Union struggled. The North had more men, more industry, and more resources, but the South had strong military leadership, familiarity with the terrain, and a cause they believed was existential. In July 1861, Union and Confederate forces clashed at the First Battle of Bull Run. It was chaotic, bloody, and shocking. Civilians had come with picnic baskets, expecting a quick Union victory. Instead, the Union Army was routed. The war would not be short. It would be brutal. Lincoln was devastated but not deterred. He replaced generals, reorganized command, and called for more troops. He spent long hours in the War Department, reading telegraphs, tracking troop movements, and poring over reports. He learned military strategy on the job, gradually growing into the role of wartime commander-in-chief. At the same time, Lincoln faced pressure from every direction. Radical abolitionists demanded immediate emancipation. Border states, slaveholding but loyal to the Union, threatened to switch sides if slavery was touched. Congress pushed for aggressive policies, while generals demanded autonomy. Lincoln had to navigate a minefield of politics, military setbacks, and public opinion, all while carrying the moral burden of preserving the Union. Through it all, he remained focused, calm, and steady. His speeches continued to inspire, his sense of humor offered relief in dark hours, and his belief in the American experiment never wavered. Lincoln understood that this war was not just about geography, it was about the soul of the nation. As the first year of war unfolded, it became clear that the struggle ahead would demand everything: resources, leadership, sacrifice, and vision. Lincoln was no longer the frontier lawyer from Illinois. He was a wartime president, facing a conflict that would define the future of freedom itself. And as the nation bled, Lincoln's thoughts turned more and more toward a truth he could no longer ignore. To truly save the Union, he might also have to destroy slavery. As the Civil War dragged on, Abraham Lincoln came to a sobering realization: preserving the Union was no longer enough. The war had to mean something more. Thousands of men were dying, cities and fields were burning, and the nation was splitting apart. Lincoln believed that if the Union survived, it must be reborn, not just restored to its former shape, but renewed with deeper principles. And at the heart of that transformation was the issue of slavery. At the start of the war, Lincoln had taken a cautious approach. He wanted to keep the border states, slave-holding states that had stayed loyal to the Union, from seceding. Publicly, he insisted that his main goal was to preserve the Union, not to end slavery. But privately, his thinking was shifting. He abhorred slavery, had always believed it morally wrong, and he now saw that the institution was fueling the very rebellion he was trying to stop. By mid-1862, after countless battles and rising death tolls, Lincoln decided to act. He would turn the war into a fight not only for the Union, but for freedom. In July, he presented a draft of the Emancipation Proclamation to his cabinet. It would declare all enslaved people in Confederate-held territories free. The decision was bold and politically dangerous. Some cabinet members feared it would alienate key supporters or push more states into rebellion. Lincoln listened, considered carefully, and then waited. He would not issue the proclamation until the Union had a military victory, so it would not appear an act of desperation. That victory came at the Battle of Antietam in September 1862. Though it was one of the bloodiest days in American history, with over 20,000 casualties, the Union had held the field. Lincoln seized the moment. On September 22, 1862, Lincoln issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. He gave the Confederacy a deadline: surrender by January 1, 1863, or he would free all enslaved people in the rebelling states. The South ignored the warning. On New Year's Day, 1863, Abraham Lincoln signed the final Emancipation Proclamation. With the stroke of his pen, over 3 million enslaved people were declared free, at least in law. While the proclamation didn't immediately free every enslaved person, and it didn't apply to the border states, it changed the character of the war. Now, the fight was not just for the Union, it was for liberty. The response was overwhelming. In the North, abolitionists rejoiced. African Americans celebrated, seeing hope for the first time in generations. In the South, slaveholders were furious. And in Europe, where support for the Confederacy had been building, the proclamation dampened sympathy. Many European nations had already abolished slavery and now saw the Union's cause as more just. Lincoln's decision was not just moral, it was strategic. The proclamation allowed black men to enlist in the Union Army, adding tens of thousands of new soldiers to the cause. These men fought bravely, often in segregated units, and played a vital role in turning the tide of war. Yet the burden of leadership remained heavy. Lincoln knew that the proclamation would not be enough on its own. Slavery had to be ended entirely, and freedom protected under law. That meant a constitutional amendment, something that would require the support of Congress and the American people. Still, the Emancipation Proclamation was a turning point. It gave the war a moral clarity that had been missing. It gave Lincoln a purpose bigger than politics. And it gave America a glimpse of what it could be, a nation where all were truly free. For Abraham Lincoln, the path forward remained hard and uncertain. But he had crossed a line he would not retreat from. The Union would be preserved, but now, it would be purified. As the war dragged into its third and fourth years, the cost became staggering. The death toll mounted, The land was scarred, and the country's divisions ran deeper than ever. Abraham Lincoln bore it all, not just as president, but as a man. The war wasn't simply a test of political endurance, it was a personal crucible. In 1863, shortly after issuing the Emancipation Proclamation, Lincoln suffered one of the greatest losses of his life. His beloved son, Willie Lincoln, died of illness at just 11 years old. Willie had been bright, kind, and deeply adored by both his parents. His death devastated Lincoln and plunged Mary Todd Lincoln into profound grief from which she never fully recovered. In the quiet moments, Lincoln would return to Willie's room, sitting alone in the stillness, overcome by sorrow. The weight of the war, already immense, grew heavier with the weight of personal tragedy. But he pressed on. He had no choice. The nation needed him. By summer 1863, the war reached a turning point. The Battle of Gettysburg in Pennsylvania became the bloodiest clash of the entire conflict. Over 50,000 soldiers were killed, wounded, or missing in just 3 days. But the Union had prevailed, and with it came a renewed hope that the tide might finally be turning. In November of that year, Lincoln was invited to speak at the dedication of the National Cemetery at Gettysburg. His speech was brief, just over 2 minutes, 272 words. But in those few moments, Lincoln delivered what many consider the greatest speech in American history. "47 years ago our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty, and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal." He honored the fallen, reframed the war's purpose, and reminded the living of their unfinished work. The Gettysburg Address transformed how Americans saw the struggle. It wasn't just about territory or secession, but about the survival of a nation dedicated to freedom and equality. Still, Lincoln faced fierce opposition. In the North, many criticized the war's cost, the draft, and the emancipation policy. Some called him a tyrant, others labeled him too weak. Newspapers mocked his appearance, questioned his leadership, and predicted his failure in the next election. His own cabinet members clashed with him. Generals came and went as he sought a military leader who could bring victory. And yet, Lincoln remained steady. His leadership was quiet but unwavering. He spent countless nights reading military dispatches, writing letters to grieving families, and walking the halls of the White House alone in deep thought. He often visited wounded soldiers in hospitals, speaking softly to them, listening to their stories, and offering what comfort he could. In 1864, Lincoln faced re-election. Many believed he would lose. The war was still raging, the nation was exhausted, and peace seemed distant. But then, Union General William Tecumseh Sherman captured Atlanta. The news lifted national morale. The tide was finally, decisively, turning. Lincoln won re-election in a landslide. For the first time in American history, a president was re-elected during wartime. It was a mandate not just for victory, but for vision, a vision of a reunited country, purged of slavery, and reborn in freedom. Despite the heavy burdens, the grief, and the endless strain, Abraham Lincoln never lost sight of the purpose that had carried him from a Kentucky log cabin to the White House. The war was not just to save the Union, it was to give it new life. But the struggle was not yet over. The final battles loomed. And even in victory, a greater trial still waited. By early 1865, the end of the Civil War was in sight. Union armies, under the command of Ulysses S. Grant and William Tecumseh Sherman, were closing in on the Confederacy from multiple directions. The South was battered, its cities burning, its economy in ruins, and its people exhausted. But Abraham Lincoln knew that even in these final stages, the greatest test still lay ahead, not just military victory, but the challenge of healing a shattered nation. Lincoln had changed profoundly over the course of the war. The lines on his face had deepened, his frame grown thinner, his eyes more tired, but his resolve had never wavered. With every letter to a grieving mother, every battlefield report, and every sleepless night, his sense of duty only strengthened. On March 4, 1865, he stood again on the steps of the U.S. Capitol to deliver his second inaugural address. Unlike his first, which had been a plea for unity, This one was somber, reflective, and spiritually profound. With malice toward none, with charity for all, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds. In just over 700 words, Lincoln gave the country a roadmap for reconciliation, one rooted not in vengeance, but in grace. He acknowledged the deep wounds of slavery, the pain of war, and the shared suffering of North and South alike. His words were not about triumph, they were about mercy. Just weeks later, on April 9, 1865, Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered to General Grant at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. The war was, at long last, over. Jubilant crowds filled the streets of Washington. Cannons fired in celebration. Flags flew from every window. The Union had been preserved, and slavery, after more than 2 centuries, was finally ending. The 13th Amendment, abolishing slavery in the United States, had passed Congress earlier that year and was in the process of ratification by the states. Lincoln's vision had been realized, but his thoughts were already turning to what came next. He knew that victory alone was not enough. The South was broken. Millions of newly freed people needed protection and opportunity. Former Confederates had to be reintegrated into the Union. The wounds of war would not heal themselves. In these final days, Lincoln seemed almost serene. Those who met with him in early April noted his sense of peace and purpose. He spoke of plans to travel, perhaps to California. He talked of his hopes for the future. He smiled more. He walked through the streets of Richmond, Virginia, the former Confederate capital, unprotected, shaking hands with freed slaves and white Southerners alike. To many, it was the beginning of a new chapter. But that chapter would not be written by Abraham Lincoln. On the night of April 14, 1865, just 5 days after Lee's surrender, Lincoln and his wife Mary attended a play at Ford's Theater in Washington. The production was Our American Cousin, a light comedy. The mood was joyful. But in the shadows of the theater, a Confederate sympathizer named John Wilkes Booth waited. At 10:15 p.m., Booth entered the presidential box and fired a single bullet into the back of Lincoln's head. Lincoln was carried across the street to a boarding house, where doctors worked through the night, but the wound was mortal. At 7:22 a.m. on April 15th, Abraham Lincoln died. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, standing at his side, famously said, "Now he belongs to the ages." The nation mourned as it never had before. Bells tolled, people wept in the streets, and funeral trains carried Lincoln's body through city after city. They lined the tracks for miles, black and white, young and old, saying goodbye to the man who had saved the Union. Abraham Lincoln's life ended in the quiet early hours of April 15, 1865, but his legacy had only begun. The shock of his assassination rippled through a nation just beginning to breathe after years of brutal war. A people who had once mocked or doubted him now mourned him as a father. Even in the former Confederacy, some recognized that Lincoln's death meant the loss of a chance for a gentler reconciliation. Lincoln had entered the presidency a relatively unknown man, a prairie lawyer from Illinois, awkward in appearance, modest in background. But he had left it a martyr, a symbol of unity, freedom, and the enduring struggle for justice. His leadership had not only saved the Union, it had redefined it. Under Lincoln, the Civil War became more than a fight over states' rights or territory. It became a battle for the soul of the United States. And by linking the Union cause to the abolition of slavery, Lincoln gave the nation a new birth of freedom, one rooted in the ideals of the Declaration of Independence. The passage of the 13th Amendment, abolishing slavery, was the first great legal triumph of this new Union. It was followed in the years after Lincoln's death by the 14th and 15th Amendments, granting citizenship and voting rights to formerly enslaved people. These were the first steps toward fulfilling Lincoln's dream of a more just and equal America. But the road would not be easy. Reconstruction brought fierce resistance. The promise of equality would be undermined by segregation, disenfranchisement, and systemic racism for generations. Yet Lincoln's words and vision endured, guiding civil rights leaders, educators, presidents, and ordinary citizens who continued the struggle he had begun. Lincoln's legacy was not confined to law and politics. it lived in the American imagination. His humility, resilience, and ability to speak to the nation's better angels became part of the country's moral compass. He showed what it meant to lead with compassion in a time of hatred, to hold firm in principle while seeking peace, and to carry the weight of leadership not for power, but for purpose. Monuments to Lincoln rose across the country, from the towering Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C., to countless statues, schools, and towns bearing his name. But his greatest monument was invisible. It was the enduring idea that America could always strive to be better, that a government of the people, by the people, for the people, must not perish from the earth. Over time, Lincoln became a symbol not only for Americans, but for people around the world. Leaders like Mahatma Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr. invoked his words. Dissidents behind the Iron Curtain read his speeches. His example inspired movements for justice and freedom far beyond the United States. Yet Lincoln was never perfect, and he never claimed to be. He evolved, sometimes slowly, wrestling with doubt, opposition, and the sheer complexity of human nature. But he always moved forward. He listened, he reasoned, he learned. And in doing so, he reminded the world that greatness is not born, it is earned, through struggle, sacrifice, and moral clarity. From the log cabin in Kentucky to the White House in Washington, from the battlefields of Gettysburg to the quiet boarding house where he drew his last breath, Lincoln's journey remains one of the most profound in history. He began his life in obscurity, and ended it as one of humanity's most enduring figures. He taught us that liberty is worth fighting for, that equality is worth striving for, and that unity is worth sacrificing for. He reminded us that even in the darkest hour, a single voice, guided by conviction and compassion, can help a broken nation find its way. And so, Abraham Lincoln belongs not only to the ages, but to every generation still searching for freedom, justice, and a more perfect union.